Hi everyone, and welcome to Risk Awareness Week 2020. It is my great pleasure to welcome again Mark Powell, who has been a fascinating speaker at 2019 Risk Awareness Week, and he's joining us again for another exciting workshop. This one you're gonna love, and I'll let Mark introduce himself, and I'll let Mark talk a little bit about set up this workshop that he has in store for you. But before I do that, please keep in mind that Risk Awareness Week, it's all about interacting, learning, and exchanging ideas. So make sure you use the comments underneath this video, ask questions, comment on other comments, and just have a conversation with each other and with us. Mark, what are you going to talk about, and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, today, this first workshop is how to build a risk matrix from scratch. For those of you who don't know, I met Alex on LinkedIn, and we both are passionate about risk management. And one of the things that we ran into on LinkedIn was a lot of discussions about risk matrices. And one thing that I've found over the years is very few people know how to build one from scratch. So I built this workshop to explain how you build one from scratch using the science and the math. To tell a little bit about myself, I've been working in a variety of industries for 50 years, effectively. And I actually had a very lucrative and successful career. I was able to retire at the tender age of 47 in 1999. And the things that inspire me and that I'm passionate about are working on those really tough technical problems. And my byline on LinkedIn was that, and my wife insisted that I change it to what I actually do. I looked at my career, and the hallmarks of my career were that I rescued doomed projects. Now, when I say doomed projects, people believed they were doomed. Everybody had given up on them, and I usually got the assignment because I was squawking about wanting a bigger challenge. And I'm happy to say that I was successful in rescuing every single one, making the project a shining example of how you should do it. The other things is I would occasionally get assigned problems that people thought were impossible to solve. In fact, in one of my jobs, after squawking a lot, I got an assignment for a problem that turns out, I found out after the fact, that the three guys before me who had attempted it had gotten fired because they didn't solve it. I ended up solving the problem. And what I do to solve these things is I apply a lot of science, I apply engineering, mathematics, but most of all, I apply a lot of critical thinking. I tried to express a lot of that critical thinking in LinkedIn. Sometimes it clicked, sometimes it didn't. But regardless, I always applied a lot of critical thinking, which was very, very effective. And of course, this talk is about using the science and math to build a risk matrix as well. I want to give you an example of a doomed project that I worked on that I rescued. This was a project I've been working at a company. I had several assignments that were mediocre and boring, and I had to ask for something challenging. And they gave me this project. This was what I consider to be a medium-sized project, 182 million budget. We had 15 years for the period of performance, and we were starting from scratch with this particular project. It had some very, very complicated problems, technical problems associated, which actually appealed to me. There were a couple of aspects of this project that were new to me, however, one of which is it had fine enforceable milestones. And that meant that if the customer did not approve us to go forward from a milestone, they would fine us $10,000 per day. That was what the fine was. So there were a series of fine enforceable milestones, the last of which was obviously the completion of the project. Well, when I got assigned this project, as with all projects, I applied some science, some engineering, some math, a lot of critical thinking. First thing we did was we developed 43 different management plans for different areas, a system engineering management plan. I was assigned the job as chief system engineer. We did have a project manager assigned. That project manager really was more of a figurehead, and I pretty much had to do his job for him. So I was the de facto project manager as well as chief system engineer. For those of you who aren't familiar, a chief system engineer is responsible for all of the technical work on a project. That's everything from the ideation all the way down to final disposal. of the project. And but yet I had to do a lot of the project management work as well. We developed 43 coordinated, very well written management plans. And as Alex will tell you, I often comment that every management plan is indeed a risk management plan. It is, however, for those risks that everybody knows are going to happen on a project, and so you can plan for it. The formal risk management on most projects is for those uncertain future outcomes that you haven't accounted for in the rest of your plans. Well, we had 43 well-coordinated plans. And that was the first thing that we did. About a month in, after we had these plans baselined, I found out that this project was a do-over of a previous project. And on the previous project, the contractor had defaulted on the contract. Turns out that they had gotten into the point where they were getting fined for missing milestones. And in fact, there were a lot of lawsuits. They were suing to get their fine money back after they defaulted. The customer was suing back. There were about 3 or 4 lawsuits going on. So I'm going, wow, this is a mess. And the original contractor had started 4 years earlier, and their budget had been $554 million. And what was remaining for the do-over, what they hadn't spent, was $182 million, which is what we got. And we had the remaining 15 years on the contract to finish it. Well, the things that I did, I actually only worked on that project for 2 years. But there is an aphorism that I want to mention to you that is very, very true. And that is that the first 5% of the effort on a project determines 95% of the total project cost. Remember that, because it's really important, and it's true. It's been my observation that how well you do in that first 5% determines everything for your success or your failure, and how close you come into budget, how close you come into schedule. Well, what I did during the first 2 years of this 15-year period of performance was I organized the project, obviously got all the management plans, but I got us through every single fine enforceable milestone. The second aspect that I neglected to mention was that all of our project records were to be available to the public on a 24-hour-a-day basis, 365-day a year. That didn't scare me, but it was certainly a new aspect to a project that most of us never face. The fact that our records, project records, have to be available for public viewing at any time. Well, I got us through all of the fine enforceable milestones except the final fine enforceable milestone, which was, of course, completion of the project. And about all we had to do after getting through those fine enforceable milestones, we had a little bit of critical design. We had about a little less than a year's worth of construction, and then a very long period of operations. For me, the construction process and the operations are extremely boring. In fact, I left a wonderful job at TRW where I was working on space shuttle at the very beginning. We got to the fifth space shuttle mission, and it became routine operations and was boring. So I was looking for more excitement, and I left that particular job. So I was going to leave no matter what. But I was at the point, I had had a lucrative career. The bonuses I got from meeting those milestones allowed me to actually retire. So I retired so I could pick and choose the fun things to work on, which is what I've been doing, and I'm having a ball. I read about this project many years later. I read about it in the paper, and the paper had a couple of things interesting in the article. First, the project completed successfully, which was great. Secondly, the project came in 2 years ahead of schedule. Now, I anticipated that they should have been able to come in 2 years ahead of schedule, but of course, without me in control, hubris, of course, I figured, well, they'll probably only come in a year ahead. Well, they came in 2 years ahead of schedule, which was great. But the most shocking thing was that the total cost of the project was only $34 million. Now, we were budgeted with $182 million. That means for the budget that we were given, we came in $148 million under budget. Remember what I said, the first 5% of the effort determines 95% of your overall project cost. This is a classic example of that. And of course, we saved $520 million over what the original defaulting contractor had to start with. And we completed in 13 years when they had 19. So that's effectively 6 years ahead of schedule. This is what I do. I love the really, really tough projects. I apply science, engineering, math. I do coding as necessary. It turns out most of the problems we run into today require some coding. Several things that I want to mention also that I don't do. I don't use assumptions. It turns out one of our speakers, there are methods, 3 different independent methods to where you could develop an objective model of uncertainty to use instead of an assumption. And they've been around a while. One of the methods was invented, in fact, or published in 1939, 81 years ago. Another of the methods was developed in 1961, totally different approach. And another one of our speakers on Risk Awareness Week, both 2019 and 2020, his father developed that method. That's pretty cool. And then the third method was developed in 1995, 3 different approaches. Well, I use those instead of making assumptions, such that the results that I give, the quantitative risk assessments to help make decisions, are all assumption-free. Now, why do people not use these? Some people do. A lot of my students do. My speculation is it does require a lot of critical thinking. It requires some science and math and some engineering for that matter, and it requires coding. You have to code these things up. And a lot of people shy away from coding for some reason. That may be an explanation, I don't know. But these methods are extremely powerful. I don't make assumptions. And I give my clients a basis to make their decisions that is objective, it's quantitative, and it doesn't require any assumptions. So that's what I do. And that's what I enjoy doing. And I enjoy the really tough technical problems. So that's kind of an introduction to me. I really didn't, I normally lay pretty low on introductions of things, but I've done some really neat things. And if any of us ever get together, I can regale you with tons of stories about the doom projects, the impossible problems that I worked on and solved, and what keeps me going. So thank you, Alex.
And in fact, during the Risk Awareness Week 2019, you actually did share, if I'm not mistaken, 3 of the many projects you've been involved in. So you had, one of the sessions was real life case studies on how to apply quantitative risk analysis. And I mean, some of those examples are absolutely mind-blowing. So all of the replays are obviously free for the Risk Awareness 2019. And anyone can go on the website 2019riskawarenessweek.com and check Mark's sessions from last year. They were amazing, and probably, well, not probably, they're just as relevant today as they were, because I wish I could say it's due to coronavirus, but it's not really due to coronavirus. Not much has changed in terms of the approach to risk management. So Mark, what are you going to talk about today?
Well, today, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about how to build a risk matrix from scratch. When I grew up in risk management, that's what we did. And I didn't know any different. I didn't know people didn't build them from scratch using science and math. And pretty much the last 15 years on LinkedIn, I have yet to find somebody who has actually done that. So I'm kind of wondering if it's a lost art. There's a lot of insight that can be gained about a risk matrix and about risk management in general if you build one from scratch using science and math. So that's what I'm going to discuss. I'm going to present that so people will have a reference for how it used to be done.
Let's try it and see if our participants, and by the way, do ask questions, write comments underneath this video. Let's see if we can replicate this in our day-to-day lives, because apparently that's the technique most used by risk professionals anywhere on the planet. Let's see how all of us stack up.
Okay, I'll get started then. Build a risk matrix from scratch. And of course, I've got a subtitle there, and why you may never want to use one. Hopefully that's the insight you walk away with from this one. So as I mentioned, I haven't met anybody in at least 25 years who has built one from scratch. Uh, while I was working risk management real heavily in the trenches, I had to build one every single time. And we'll talk about that. You know, risk matrices, they're sometimes called heat maps, sometimes they're called uh, probability impact graphs or PIGs. Not a bad name for them. There are other names for them as well. They're used very commonly in project management, risk management. We see them all the time, and they've been used for a long time, at least 45 years that I personally can attest to. The sole purpose, and this is one of the things that Alex will reinforce, and I want to reinforce it as well. The whole purpose of risk management and risk matrices is to make decisions. And we want to make good decisions. And that's the only reason we ever build a risk matrix. And there are a lot of people out there. There are many papers that question the use of risk matrices altogether. You know, on LinkedIn, I used to be very active on LinkedIn. I'm not anymore because it just takes too much of my time. There are a lot of people who just decry the use of risk matrices. There are other people as well that you know, absolutely love them and will never abandon them no matter what's told to them. Some people say that risk matrices are terrible for decision making. Some say they absolutely can't be fixed. Well, let's go through. My introduction to risk matrices, say, was in the middle 1970s, about 1975. I started in risk management for the United States Department of Defense projects, and we had a very specific way that we built them. And it turns out we always built, anytime we were going to make an important decision, we built a risk matrix from scratch to support the decision maker. We used science and math to build that. That's what I'm going to present today, how we did that. And we actually used a new risk matrix for every decision, actually for every risk for that matter. So we didn't have one risk matrix with a whole lot of risks on it. That was a totally new concept to me that was introduced to me in the late 1990s. I was surprised that people could do that. Seemed like it might work pretty well. Maybe, maybe not. But I haven't met anybody the past 25 years, couldn't find anybody on LinkedIn to step up and say that they had built a risk management from scratch. Big question, is it a completely lost art? I don't know. We'll find out. I'm going to show you how to build a risk management from scratch using science and math in this presentation. But before I get started, I want to show you how most people build risk matrices today. So I'm going to move over to Excel. And let me see here, find my Excel spreadsheet. There we go. Let's share that. Okay, I just opened Excel. And I'm going to show you how I've observed most people building their risk matrices. Well, the first thing in Excel is easy to use. Well, I'm going to have on this A column, I am going to have my my terms for probability. So let's see, let's go out here far enough to where we got enough room there. And of course, these 5, I'm going to build a 5 by 5 because everybody's accustomed to 5 by 5. So let's make those about that tall. Here's these next 5. I need to make these, let's say, about that big. Okay, let's go ahead. We're going to use, let's say, 22-point font, so it'll be big enough. I'll bold it. Let's center both of those. That's where our probability expressions will be. And of course, this is where our consequence terms will be. Let's go out here to make this plenty big enough. That ought to be big enough. And we'll go ahead and take these 5 right here. Also make those 22-point fonts so everybody will be able to see it. And I'm going to turn those vertical. I'm going to rotate that text up. And we're going to center them and square them up. Okay, well, the first thing we need to do, we need to come up with some, I'm going to say, nebulous terms for a very low probability. Let's see what a good one is. Well, for very, very low probability, well, let's say fat chance. Okay. Something that's a little bit more probable than a fat chance. Well, it's supposedly possible. That's a little bit more. Now we get kind of the medium range of probabilities. Well, maybe it could happen. Okay, we're starting to get into the real probables here. So let's do, uh-oh. Okay, that's a good term for something maybe can happen for sure. And now we're into the very probable. Well, that could be a sure thing. All right. So we've got our probability scale from fat chance up to sure thing for a 5 by 5. Now this is for very, very low consequences. Well, who cares? Whoops, let's spell it correctly. Who cares? All right. Something that is a consequence that's a little worse, well, you're not going to like it. So let's say don't like it. All right. And our next one, well, these are starting to get some pretty bad consequences. So this is bad. Okay. Now we're getting some really serious consequences. Holy crap. All right. And another term for just really terrible, terrible consequences. Oh, end of the world. So we have 5 nebulous expressions that are in successively increasing probability and 5 nebulous expressions in increasing level of consequence. Well, we got to color our blocks, put our blocks in. Let's go ahead and outline these things with let me put a thick border on there. And so we're going to take that one and we're just going to go ahead and put all of those there. And now we need to color them. So let's color, let me see, I'm going to color those 5 all green. Okay, maybe cover these 3 green. That's going to look pretty good. And let's say those 2 green. Okay. As far as reds are concerned, let's color those red. Let's see, let's color these 2 red. And let's color that one red. And of course, we have to color the rest of these yellow because our colors for a risk matrix are red, yellow, and green. So let's color those yellow. Let's color these 2 yellow. And let's color those 2 yellow. And that probably looks a lot like a risk matrix you've seen before. Maybe the boxes are a little different places. And if you hired an expensive risk consultant, I'm sure these terms that you see over here and over here for probabilities are selected from some big list that you could find on the web to refer to different levels of people's expectation for probabilities and bad consequences. But I'll contend that these communicate pretty well. From fat chance to sure thing and who cares to end of the world pretty much gives us a nice linear. Now you saw how long it took. So I basically pulled back the curtain here on what these expensive risk consultants do when they build a risk matrix. This is how you do it. And I won't do this for you, but I will tell you that if you want to send me a crisp $1 bill and a self-addressed stamped envelope, I will be happy to print this out for you and send it to you. But just bear in mind, you've overpaid. So that's how most people build risk matrices. Sure, some of the risk managers use more sophisticated terms for these axes here, but it's about what you got. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the presentation. This is how most people build risk matrices. Many of you who are watching this maybe have built them pretty much the same way. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. I see Alex grinning. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay, so that's how
by the way, if anyone is watching us and wants to get their hands on this amazing risk matrix that Mark just built, write in the comments below and we'll send it to you.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. But that's how I see most risk matrices. I mean, a lot of people do a lot of funky things to risk matrices. So sometimes they do other things, but that's pretty much the basic. That's what I've seen. Now, I've never seen that. I will be perfectly honest with you. I've never seen that until the late 90s. It was a shock to me that people did those things because that's not the way I learned it. I want to remind you, the risk matrix is always used for decision making. I mean, just in risk matrix in general, we have three alternatives for in risk. If it's red, we're going to expend resources to mitigate the risk, which is reducing the probability that some outcome level or above, outcome level or below is going to actually be realized. If it's yellow, the alternative is to expend resources to monitor it, get more data, watch it to see if it turns red or turns green. And if it's green, we allow the outcome to be realized and just take the hit. Whatever it costs, whatever we benefit from it, we benefit from it. So that's a general decision with three alternatives that's just fundamental to risk management. Very often risk matrices, this is something also I've never seen before until the late 90s, it's used for prioritizing risk. You'll pin a whole bunch of risk on one matrix. In fact, there are a lot of risk management consultants who they make their living off of facilitating large group meetings where a lot of engineers and a lot of executives all get together and try to come to some consensus of where to pin various risks on a matrix. A matrix very much like the one I presented to you for the purposes of prioritizing. They'll take all the reds and put them in an order, all the yellows and put them in order, and all the greens in order. And it can be quite contentious. And it does require a lot of, I will say it definitely does require a lot of facilitating to get that to work. So there are some people that make a living doing that. Some of them may be watching this presentation as well. You know who you are. If a risk maker, I want to make sure you realize, if a risk maker sees a risk matrix, they're going to be influenced by it in making the decision. I mean, the red, yellow, green is something ubiquitous in our universe. All of our stoplights have that. They influence you. So if somebody sees something in a red box, they're going to think differently, regardless of what their original feelings are. So no matter what, we've been in some discussions on LinkedIn where people say, oh, we never use our risk matrix for decision making, but we just use it to kind of get a feel for what the risks are relative to one another. Well, that's a decision in itself. And if the decision maker sees it, they're going to be influenced by it. Whether you actually mechanically use it to make the decision or not, it will influence it. So I'm going to show you the 7 steps for how to build a risk matrix from scratch. And we're using science and math. The very first one is to choose a risk factor formula. Now, a lot of the standards, including 31,000 says a risk is a combination of probability and consequence. Actually, that's a risk factor that is a combination. A risk, and I recommend you go back and look at my first session on Risk Awareness Week 2019, where we talk about the philosophy and the concepts. It's really important. What a risk actually is some uncertain future outcome. Now, we measure a risk by calculating the probability that some outcome level or above or outcome level or below will be realized given the data and information that we have. But a risk factor is what you're talking about when you have a combination of probability and consequence. And typically you're talking about some point estimate of probability, some point estimate of consequence, rather than actually the uncertainty that's involved. So, but we do have to choose a risk factor formula. Now, the most common one, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, I had never seen this till the late 90s either, is a simple product formula. It is probability times consequence. And that's what most people use and what most people pin on risk matrices today. But that is actually a risk factor. And it works real well, especially if you normalize the consequences on a scale between 0 and 1. That way your risk factor is always going to be between 0 and 1. Probability is always between 0 and 1 as well. The one I grew up using, starting in the middle 1970s, was this formula, which is kind of a parallel resistor, parallel capacitor formula. And we normalized in this particular case the consequences on a scale between 0 and 1 for this one. Our risk factors always range between 0 and 1 in this case, but that's what I grew up using. When I first saw the product formula, I thought, what's going on here? This is crazy. Now, bear in mind, in the 90s, I had seen Mill Standard 883 that uses that product formula. However, that was past the point where it was still being used as a valid standard. And if you want to know about it, that's the reason why I thought it was no longer in use. There are many other formulas that I've seen. Some of them use logarithms, some of them use exponentials, some of them use exponents in these two formulas. You can do just about whatever you want. Ideally, you'd like your risk factor to come in somewhere between 0 and 1, just for convenience sake, as you'll see in a minute. But there are a lot of different risk factor formulas. Step 2, we've got 2 axes. One axis, we know the units. They're units of probability. They'll either be percentage points or they'll be just fractions between 0 and 1. But we have another axis. And if you do science and engineering, you know if you have a 2-dimensional graph, one axis has one set of units, the other axis has another. So you need to choose a set of units for the consequences. Okay, this can be problematic because most risks have multiple types of consequences that have different units. So you've got to choose one. DOD always chose dollars. Now, DOD had a lot of rigorous formulas that they forced upon us to use that would convert, say, the life of a soldier, the life of a private versus the life of a sergeant. They actually have dollar values for those kinds of things. The loss of a vehicle, the loss of an aircraft, they had dollar values. They had a lot of different formulas that we would use for those consequences where we could fold them in for making decisions. And dollars turned out to be a pretty good unit because everybody kind of understands money. Everybody has to deal with money. Everybody kind of understands it. Regardless, you've got to transform consequences that are not in those native units that you selected into those units. And as I said, it's best to normalize that axis between 0 and 1, the worst case consequences and best case consequences. Step 3, choose risk factor levels for those unacceptable risks. In other words, anything above a certain risk factor level is unacceptable. Anything below is acceptable. Below another risk factor level is for acceptable risk. Now, DOD chose conveniently 0.07. Remember, the risk factor ranged between 0 and 1. For anything above 0.7 was unacceptable, and they chose for their acceptable level 0.3. If you think about it, that sounds pretty good. You've got 30% for acceptable, 30% for unacceptable, and the rest is yellow. But you can choose any values that are suitable to the decision maker. I've seen other risk factors chosen. 0.6, I've seen 0.2 chosen for acceptable, I've seen 0.5 chosen for acceptable. It just varies with each particular problem and each particular risk. So that's step 3. Now steps 4 through 7, pretty simple. Draw the ISO contours of equivalent risk factors. The whole reason we use a risk matrix is we know that there may very well be a very high probability, very low consequence risk as equivalent to the decision maker as a very high consequence, but low probability risk. In fact, there's a whole scale. And in fact, with these risk factors, we can draw ISO contours of equivalent risk factors. And that's really important because that's really what we're doing with the risk matrix. And you'll see in the further steps how this comes into play. You want to color the ISO contour regions. Clearly, we want to color above our risk factor level for unacceptable, red, and below the risk factor level for acceptable, green, and in between, yellow. It's pretty simple process. It makes sense with everything we do in risk management. Step 6, you're going to have to pick a number of equivalently valued, evenly spaced breaks on each axis. Most people use a 5 by 5 in the example that will follow. I'm going to use a 5 by 5, but I've seen risk matrices that have been 2 by 1. I've seen 10 by 3. I've seen a whole bunch of different crazy values, and people will do a lot of things. But you have to choose what you think works best for a particular problem, and you're going to draw the boxes. Bear in mind, these are equivalent in value and evenly spaced. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then you color your boxes with the colors, and you color them with the predominant color in each box. For example, if it's mostly red, you put it red. Okay, that's easy. 7 steps, pretty easy to do. Let me give you a demonstration. Step 1, everybody's familiar with a product formula we'll use the standard product formula for a risk factor. We're going to also normalize the consequences between 0 and 1 for this. Let's use dollars for our consequences. That's a unit everybody is familiar with. We're going to have to transform all of our consequence types that are in other units to dollars based on decision maker values. That's important. Dollars, of course, if the consequences are independent, they're easy to add. That works real well. And for convenience, we're going to normalize for ISO contour production but we're going to keep the dollar amounts on the axis. We're going to normalize to a 0 to 1 scale. And in this particular problem, we're going to have a losses from 0 to $100,000. That gives an example. Step 3, we're going to choose what DOD chose. 0.7 for unacceptable and 0.3. We could pick other numbers, but those are numbers I've already introduced, and they seem fairly reasonable to everybody. Step 4, we're drawing our ISO contours. Now we see our ISO contours there. Those are lines of equivalent risk factor or equivalent risk to the decision maker. And you see the different values over on the right side. We're going to color the ISO contour regions. Those above 0.7, we're going to color red. Those below 0.3, we're going to color green. And the region in between, we're going to color yellow. Now, step 6, we're going to choose in this particular case to use a 5 by 5. And I'll tell you the reason why I chose to use a 5 by 5. That's because my plot picked nice 5 by 5 points, 5 intervals on both axes for me. So why not? That's real easy. We can draw those lines. That gives me my boxes. Step 7, color the boxes the predominant color. I do that and I get a risk matrix that looks like that. The risk matrix is complete. That wasn't that hard to do. Pretty easy, but that's building one using a little bit of science and math instead of just, to be honest with you, just making it up like I did with the first example. It turns out that the risk factor formula that you choose drives everything. If you'll notice on the left, those are our ISO contours for our product formula. For that parallel formula that I used in DOD, you'll notice that the contours look radically different. No surprise, different formulas. But those for the left, for your risk matrix, those ISO contours or equivalent risk are likewise on the right. We color the contours. Notice the colors look a whole lot different. They're in different locations because of the risk factor. We pick our same 5 by 5 boxes, and then we color it in. Risk matrix looks radically different depending on the risk factor formula that you choose. Here's where you have to use some real serious critical thinking as to what risk factor is appropriate for your particular problem, for your particular risk that you're going to be using. And let's suppose that we go ahead and pin on each matrix a risk at a probability of 50% and a consequence level of 0.5 or $50,000. Ooh. With one risk factor formula, it's a green risk. With the other risk factor formula, it's a red risk. The risk factor formula drives everything that we do. So bear in mind, that's a bit of a shock. One thing I want to mention to you, when you use a risk matrix, you are going to be artifactually adding either risk tolerance or risk aversion. Now, I could go through a long series of a whole bunch of complicated math and show that to you. You can either do that math yourself, it's not that hard, but it's pretty easy to visualize. With our product formula, we have concave ISO contours. It turns out that concave, good rule of thumb here, is a concave ISO contours are always going to add a little bit of risk tolerance. And it's an artifactual addition of risk tolerance. You'll notice that that matrix that we had looked quite a bit different. It had a lot more green on it than the other one. If we use that parallel formula, we get convex ISO contours. Now, this is the reason why DOD used that formula. DOD was extremely conservative. They were risk averse. So it didn't hurt to add a little additional risk aversion for them. And that's the reason why we used it. Now, of course, my primary fields are science and engineering. Scientists and engineers are almost always risk averse. So this was all very natural to me. Other people in other fields, maybe a lot more risk tolerant, and this product formula may be more suitable. But good rules of thumb, if the contours, the ISO contours are concave, you're going to be artifactually adding some risk tolerance. And if they're convex, you're going to be adding some risk aversion. So this is something you can't avoid. It's guaranteed. As I said, we can go through a big, long, boring thing, and I could present that to you. I'd lose everybody if I did that. But those are good rules of thumb to follow, and you can do the math if you want to step up and do it. You don't have to believe me. There are some construction challenges that may have occurred to you when I was building these. Maybe they didn't, but I want to go through them. One we mentioned is the selection of the risk factor. That clearly, or the risk factor formula, that clearly changes things radically. I mentioned to you that the intervals and the axes, the boxes, should be the same size and they should be equivalent in value. And I'm not talking about the consequence units or the probability units, the value of the decision maker, how the decision maker values those. It's based on those decision maker values. But when you look at a graph or a matrix or a graph like this, everybody thinks in terms of linear. So you want that, even though the values may change quite a bit, they're looking for a linear relationship on each axis. Let's see what that does to us. So the axis should be linear in value as well. However, values on consequences are rarely linear, okay? The values in the range of $0 to $100 may be radically different between $100 and $200. Values on probabilities, believe it or not, are often nonlinear. We'll go through a couple of cases for that. Sometimes those are personal value driven. People actually have values or probabilities. If you haven't seen that, look for it. You'll see it. Sometimes the problem drives the values and the probabilities to a nonlinearity. We'll talk about that as well. These nonlinearities in values will warp the ISO contours, the risk factor ISO contours, and the risk matrix altogether. Marginal value of money, we used as a consequence unit dollars, because everybody is familiar with money and everybody knows that the more money you have, the less you value additional money. For example, if you're extremely rich and you see a $10 bill on the ground, you may not bother to pick it up. If you only have $10 in your pocket, and that's all you have to your name, you'll definitely pick it up. And everybody is familiar with the picture of the fat cat executive, ultra rich guy lighting cigars with $100 bills. That, by the way, hopefully you can tell by the picture, that is not me. I wouldn't even light a cigar with $100 of Monopoly money. That's how tight I am. But regardless, this is a very, very common phenomenon. The marginal value money is well understood. As I mentioned, Clement and Riley, in their book, Making Hard Decisions, go through it in great depth. It's a well-known curve. It has an exponential shape. And I've got it in terms of losses. They're plotted for you. And you'll see as the losses turn into gains over on the left, right up here, you'll see it flattens out because more money that you have, in other words, a negative loss, doesn't mean a whole lot more to you. But the larger the loss, your value goes down tremendously and very, very rapidly. So this is a well-known curve, and it varies between people. You may have, the decision maker may have used this curve instead of the black curve, or maybe even that blue curve. They really, really don't care. I mean, they really value larger losses a whole lot worse. But it's always that similar exponential shape that you'll see. And this is, like I say, this is clear in Clement and Riley. Now, the effect is on your risk matrix, you want to break that y-axis into equal intervals of value. And in this particular case, it turned out that I've got 5 easy intervals between that relative value of minus 4,000 up to 1,000. That's 5,000 units. You can see those 6 orange lines. They give me 5 intervals. And of course, you see where they cross the actual cost line, the additional cost line. This now gives us breaks for our matrix in equal value units. Now, instead of 0, we go to a gain of $500,000 to $25,000 instead of 0 to 20. And instead of between 20 and 40, we go from 25 to 57K of losses, and so on. These are different numbers. We can go ahead and keep those numbers, but those give us our breaks. So the matrix is going to have those numbers, minus 500K, 25K, 57, 74, 88, 97K, along the axes for those breaks, those 5 breaks that we've got. This should also change the risk matrix quite a bit, specifically the risk isocontours, because we have to apply the inverse transform of this to make the isocontours look correctly. On the left is our standard product formula, and I use C star for the transform, and you see down here the new values that we just calculated for those breaks, but the isocontours look dramatically different now. As you might suspect, the rest of our construction of the matrix is going to change. We do our coloration, which was the next step. You can see that those colored regions change quite a bit as a result of that different value of money. Our blocks are in the same place. However, the dollar values along that axis change, and our reds, yellows, and greens change. Well, this may look a little bit more comforting to you than this from a risk matrix perspective. But that's what happens when you take into account the proper values. Now we have linearity along this consequence axis. Now we're still operating as if this is a linear axis as well, but we have these blocks. So if we pin a risk on this matrix, the 50-50 would be somewhere right about here now. Okay, that we looked at before. It would be in the yellow instead of the green or the red. It was previously in the red. So that changes things quite a bit. There are probability value effects. People have values on probabilities. Also, people have weird psychological numerical distortions. People do terribly with very large numbers and very small numbers. Typically, once you get above a certain number, let's say 99.9, it doesn't make any difference how many nines you go out, they value it the same. Likewise on small numbers. And of course, for a lot of our risks that we deal with, especially in engineering and science, the things I work in, you know, we're looking perhaps at safety. Safety always has tiny little numbers. Mission assurance, very large numbers. People also have values on probabilities. I've seen decision makers for whom it didn't make any difference whether the probability was 70% or 99.99999%. It was the same to them. Likewise, on the low end, you get below a certain point, it didn't make any difference. So both numerical distortions and probability values warp the risk factor isocontours just like the consequence values do, but it changes the other axis. And while we have this particular the probability values could change this matrix that we just had from changing the values of the consequence appropriately according to the decision maker. It could change that into something that looks like this. And you'll notice we have different probability values for each box. Now this is the normalized. These are the normalized numbers, but you'll notice each box has a different number. Instead of 0.8, it's 0.689, I believe. So the risk matrix has changed quite a bit. However, this risk matrix that got transformed may look like something that looks good to you. Looks a little better to me than the one that we had before. This happens, and you have to take these things into account properly. You have to figure out what the formula is for the probability values versus values on probability versus probability, and inverse transform it into the risk isocontours, and then we go through the same steps. Now, also, you can get problem effects on the probability axis. A lot of unacceptable risks for some problems are at extremely small probability values. For example, Vandenberg Air Force Base launches all of our polar orbiting satellites. That means they have to launch due north, which they can't because that'll go over California, or due south. Well, when they go due south, they come pretty close to Los Angeles. And the launch rule is that if there is a 3 × 10⁻⁵ risk of one person in Los Angeles being killed by a launch, they don't launch. Now, a person can be killed in Los Angeles because a rocket breaks up. And these solid rockets have really nasty chemical fuels. So a chunk of fuel could land in a play yard, schoolyard, playground, and a child touching it could die of cancer 10 years later. So they literally operate that way. And they do not launch if, based on the winds, based on everything else, the risk exceeds 3 × 10⁻⁵. That's a small risk. It's a small acceptable risk. Let me tell you, that's going to really warp the risk matrix. International Space Station, no degree. This is one project that I worked on very closely and helped develop their rule. And this is a case where we ended up with a 3-by-1 risk matrix. It turns out that we can actually, what we humans can do is we can detect and track a 10-centimeter object up in space. And it turns out that there's hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris in orbit, and most of them are busted up. We're not talking about meteors or asteroids. We're talking about junk, space junk from launches. Most of them are old rocket bodies, some are old defunct satellites, some are exploded rocket bodies and pieces of them, some are exploded satellites. They're all over the place. And we can track, however, only objects 10 centimeters, about a softball size, and larger. Now, the thing that's interesting is if one of these objects, 10 centimeters or larger, is going to collide with the space station, the relative velocity of that collision is 17 kilometers per second. That's not per hour, that's per second. And even for, say, the mass of a softball, which is going to be measured in grains, it's not going to be measured in kilograms, I'll let you do the 1/2 mv squared calculation using that 17 kilometers per second and calculate how much energy is involved in even a collision with a softball-sized object. And I'll tell you what you're going to get is a small thermonuclear tactical explosion. In other words, the space station is going to be lost. You're going to lose all the astronauts. Astronauts are the most expensive people on the planet. And of course, the space station is 150 billion or more now, probably 250 billion now as an asset. But of course, it changes a whole country's spirit when something like that happens. Well, we can do something about these risks. What we can do is we can move out of the way. We can fire the rockets. The space station, it turns out, it has over an acre of solar cells, and those solar cells cause the space station to orbit. There's enough atmosphere for that orbit to degrade, where they have to reboost the orbit, 3-4 times per year. But anytime they have an unscheduled reboost, which is what they do, move out of the way if there's a potential collision, it ruins months of microgravity experiments. In fact, it may ruin the experiments completely. And considering that it costs between $10,000 and $100,000 per pound to get those experiments up there, and it took tons of astronaut time tending those experiments, and astronaut time is the most expensive labor hour in this solar system, people generally don't want to do that. So we'd rather not maneuver out of the way, but we have to protect the astronauts, protect the space station. So we came up with a rule. We do move out of the way if the probability of collision is 10 to the minus 4. We order up extra tracking, which is expensive to see whether the objects are getting closer or further away. Very expensive to get that extra tracking if we can. If the risk of collision is between 10 to the minus 5 and 10 to the minus 4, that would be a yellow risk. Or we tell the astronauts to go up in the cupola and watch it go by if the risk is less than 10 to the minus 5. And I'll tell you, from having worked on this personally and coming up with this risk approach for degree avoidance, we came up with that acceptable risk of 10 to the minus 5 because an astronaut that lives in Houston proper and has to drive the Gulf Freeway down to Clear Lake, where NASA is, every day, they experience a risk of dying in a traffic accident of about 10 to the minus 5. We figure if they can live with a 10 to the minus 5 risk of coming to work every day when they're on the ground, they can sustain that risk on orbit. And that's literally where we came up with it. These probability levels will distort the matrix because they're so small. In fact, you'll end up with just about everything red if you tried to use a linear. But of course we don't. And in the course of the case, the space station, we had a 3x1. We had red if the probability of collision was greater than 10 to the minus 4, yellow if it was in between 10 to the minus 4 and 10 to the minus 5, and green if it was less than 10 to the minus 5. It worked really well. They've been using that since space station went up in the late 90s. And this was one of those projects, one of those exciting, interesting projects I got to work on. So this affects the probability axis and is going to warp the risk matrix. Also, another problem that we run into, one of the experiences I had when I was young is, I mentioned earlier that every time working in DIA, we always built a new risk matrix every time we had a new risk identified and a decision had to be made. Well, I was told to go build a brand new risk matrix. And I said, well, why can't we use the one I built last month? And they said, I don't care. We're the parent. We're your mentor and your parent. We're in parent mode. So do what I say. Go do it. Well, I finally realized what was going on is that decision maker values are non-stationary. They're not constant in time. And you literally can run into problems if those values change rapidly. So you don't want to use a matrix that you used months before or even weeks before, because the values and the particular risk might have changed. And they could change, those values could change on the consequences, or they could change on the probabilities, or they could change on both. So we want to ideally construct the risk matrix just before the decision is going to be made to minimize the effects of this non-stationarity of values. And I have seen cases personally in my career where we built a risk matrix the day before we were going to present, and it just happens Congress approved a budget for our particular project, and the decision maker was the least bit worried about the red risk that we had identified and put on the matrix. That's because their values changed. They weren't as worried because the budget was not at risk. So, big question that we come to, can you get a reasonably good decision using a risk matrix? I mean, a decision that you'd be happy with, the decision maker is going to be happy with. Well, to quote the old Grey Poupon commercial, but of course, sure you can get a reasonably good decision using a risk matrix. I don't want you to think that I'm saying you can't. You have to do some things, however. You've got to pick the right risk factor formula. We saw how sensitive your risk matrix is going to be, and the decision is going to be to your risk factor formula. So you got to apply some critical thinking to pick that right risk factor formula. You may have to derive a new one. You have to pick a set of units for that consequence actions that the decision maker is going to be comfortable with. You've got to know your decision maker. Here again, you got to apply some good critical thinking. And of course, for all the consequence types that are not in those units, you have to transform them into those selected units properly. That can become more complicated. DoD, fortunately for me, had a whole bunch of formulas already established that we had to use for transforming those consequences and adding them together to make one risk, one set of dollars. You have to elicit from the decision maker what their values are on the selected units. Now, I will tell you, Clement and Riley have a whole large section of their book. The book is Making Hard Decisions about multi-attribute utility theory, which is basically methods to elicit decision maker values. My personal experience, decision makers don't like going through that, but that's a whole nother story. Still, you have to have a feel for what their values are. You've got to be realistic. You can't just apply your values. You'll skew the decision if you do that. You've got to pick the right risk factor values for the unacceptable and the acceptable risk levels. Clearly, it's got to be something with which the decision maker will be comfortable and familiar. And you have to properly transform the risk matrix axes based on the values of the decision maker for both consequences and the probabilities, which are going to warp the risk factor isocontours and consequently the whole risk matrix. You got to do those things right. Good decision. And you also want to do all of this close enough in time to the decision such that the decision maker values don't change very much. You do all of that, you get a reasonably good decision. Otherwise, well, you might be better off on your decision if you just roll these dice. I think these are Dungeons and Dragons dice, whole bunches of sets. You might need the whole big wad to make a good decision if you don't do all of those things. Originally in this presentation, I had a picture of chicken entrails and somebody feeling the chicken entrails. That was not really an attractive image, so I thought I'd use dice instead. But you could hire a soothsayer that's going to feel around the chicken entrails as well to make your decision. In conclusion, I've shown you how to use some science and some math to build a good risk matrix from scratch. This is what I got started doing. I didn't know for 20-something years that you could do it differently. It's not all that horribly difficult. There's 7 steps, but it's not all that easy to do it right. And the key is you've got to apply a lot of critical thinking. There can be a lot of challenges to doing it right. It's not just quick like a 2-minute exercise like I did to start out with to show you how most of them are built. And theoretically, you can get a reasonably good decision using a risk matrix. And I love to quote Yogi Berra here. Yogi Berra said, in theory, there's not much difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. So one thing that is true, you can never get an optimal decision using a risk matrix. You may get a reasonably good decision if you build it properly. So from a practical standpoint, you're not going to get an optimal decision. You can't. Now, you can get an optimal decision using a good quantitative risk assessment and not use a risk matrix and not use any assumption. This is what I specialize in doing, which is why I never use a risk matrix anymore. So the question you have to ask yourself after seeing how you use science and math to build a risk matrix from scratch and seeing the sensitivities and how you would define reasonably good on your decision. The question is, do you still want to use a risk matrix? And to quote Clint Eastwood, do you feel lucky? I want to thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you get some insights about risk matrices from what I've presented here. I think there are a ton of insights for going through this exercise. I know I had tons of insights from going through this because it was a lot of trial and error in my career. And like I said, it was the late 90s when I first saw the product formula. It was the late 90s when I first saw somebody pinning multiple risk on a single matrix. I didn't know people did that. So anyway, I've shown this to you. You now have seen. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. There's my contact information. Obviously, contact Alex and get a good discussion started. You may think this is all baloney and then I've just made it up. Well, I could show you a few documents, some DoD documents where we actually did it. There's my website. You can see some papers on the website. There's tons of educational materials, papers where there were some really complex decision problems where we used risk and risk management to solve them. And some of them are a lot of fun. They're the types of things that really excite me. A whole lot more things that I can't do because of my consulting generally, proprietary information, and I never can publish about it. I also have another Risk Awareness Week 2020 presentation on Monte-Carlo that I think you'll find interesting too. And for reference purposes to this one, I don't know if, I think this will be up. You might want to go back to Risk Awareness Week 2019 and view those presentations that I made then. But don't hesitate to contact me if you have something really exciting that you think is an impossible decision problem. And most of these that you'll see in the papers were problems that had lain fallow for like a year or more, 18 months in some cases, because people just couldn't come to a decision. And after I presented the results in every single case, the decision was made instantly. I mean, in a matter of minutes. So it can be done. And of course, sometimes making a decision saves you more money than putting it off. So thank you very much, Alex. Do you have any questions?
Thank you very much, Mark. I want to summarize, and by the way, use the opportunity to ask questions and write comments below this video. I want to summarize because it's really bad news for people that have been plucking their risk matrices out of marketing brochures from best practice organizations and large institutes and auditing firms. It seems that you can't take a marketing brochure and then seriously apply it to your organizations and expect meaningful and useful decisions. I'm very sorry to disappoint you, everyone who is watching this and who is surprised by this, but this is what Risk Awareness Week is all about. Risk awareness is all about challenging common misconceptions in risk management by bringing science back to the table. The whole irony is that proper statistical, mathematical, decision science, probability theory, all of those fields have been properly applied centuries before this new breed of risk management appeared. And then this new breed of risk management kind of just overtook the discipline, the profession, and now we are in the minority, which is just completely bizarre, bizarre to me. We have to yet again prove that year 7 math is still solid, and even with year 7 math, you can destroy any risk matrix that is sold to us as best practice. So amazing presentation. Thank you very much, Mark. And by the way, this is a very important point. Mark has another session, and Mark is being very, very fair. He's showing us many reasons for either getting the risk matrix right or not pretending that it's a useful exercise. But also, the alternative, because I'm guessing what the question in everyone's head is, what's the alternative? Well, one of the common alternatives is, scenarios, simulations, sensitivity analysis. And the other session, which I encourage everyone to register for and watch, Mark, you will talk a little bit about some of the limitations and the downsides of even the most common quantitative risk techniques like simulations, like monte-carlo simulation, which is wonderful. So Mark is being very fair. He's ridiculing the most common technique used, but he's also challenging some of the kind of more advanced techniques that we use in risk management. Is that what we can expect from your other session, Mark?
Well, yes, it's not so much a point to challenge. Actually, I'm revealing in this other session a solution to one of the age-old problems with Monte Carlo. And that question is, how many samples should you use? And I've developed a technique where you no longer have to worry about the number of samples that you use. And it is a risk-based, which is why it's so relevant. I mean, not only Monte Carlo is used in, it is kind of the gold standard tool to use in risk assessment and risk management. You will literally hear those words used, that Monte Carlo is the gold standard tool. And in this particular case, I'm going to discuss and go through Monte Carlo, what it's all about, how it actually works, and then show a technique where we don't have to even answer that question. And this is kind of an exposure to the world of a new technique that will help resolve all the problems that people have run into. One problem, just for example, on LinkedIn, we've seen discussions where somebody would write in and say, I ran my Monte Carlo a second time and I got a different answer the second time. Or they ran it 3 or 4 times and got different answers. They just didn't quite understand why. And unfortunately on LinkedIn, there have been some very, very bad advice for what to do for those particular situations. But it's a common phenomenon. And I will explain the math behind it and why it happens and demonstrate it happening. And then I will demonstrate a technique that I've developed where, I'm making this is not something I'm holding proprietary. I'm making it available to the world because everybody uses Monte Carlo, should be using it. So this is kind of the debut for this technique. And it's not that I'm challenging so much, but I'm showing the solution to the problems. I'm gonna obviously make the problem evident in the presentation, but then I'm gonna show you how to solve it. And it's a pretty slick, easy solution.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for watching us. Keep asking your questions and writing comments underneath, and we'll be able to respond to you in writing under this video. And we'll see you in the next session. Thanks everyone. Bye.